Welcome back and good afternoon. I'm Stacey Delicat. Thanks so much for being with us today. This afternoon, we will be bringing you live coverage out of Tallahassee, Florida, where the murder trial against Henry Segura officially got underway this morning. All right, we're going to take a little break for this because the examiner there is just, the fingerprint examiner is just getting to some photos of the hallway bathroom in Brandy Peters' home. And that is the bathroom where, as I mentioned earlier, the three children's bodies were found piled one on top of the other. We're talking about Peter's two twin daughters, 6 years old. They were named Tamaya and Tanaya, and then Javante Segura, 3 years old, who you see on the right. That was Crystal Peters' son with Henry Segura. Now, both Javante and Tanaya Peters were determined to have died from drowning, but Tamaya Peters, one of the twins, apparently died from a gunshot wound to the back of the head. Just a gruesome, gruesome crime. And as for Brandy Peters herself, while she was found shot 7 to 8 times with 4 bullets found in her body, in her head, her ear, her chest, and her abdomen, the medical examiner ultimately determined that she died from blunt trauma to the head and the face. So investigators believe there was likely quite a struggle that went on in the home. There was a fake nail that had broken off that was found. There was blood splattered all over. There was a plant that was knocked over. And so this was a really messy, gruesome crime scene. Let me bring in the two guests I have joining me live this afternoon. Here in studio, I have Paula Natari. She's a criminal defense attorney. And joining us live via Skype from the Fort Lauderdale area is Sue Ann Robinson, who's a former prosecutor and now a criminal defense attorney. So thank you guys both so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, great to be here.
Let's talk about the fact that this is the second time this trial is happening. This is a retrial. The jury came back in 2017, hung jury. They could not agree on a verdict. They split 8-4, though they were leaning towards acquittal. So this is a second round for both sides. I'll start with you, Sue Ann. If you're the prosecutor coming in and you have a retrial, it didn't go your way the first time, what are you doing differently? Are you preparing your witnesses differently? How do you approach a retrial like this?
I think you approach a retrial like this by trying to take it back and really get into the details that you may have missed initially. You always do Monday night quarterbacking as a prosecutor, even as a criminal defense attorney. So the fact that they have an opportunity to not only look back at what they presented, now they have an opportunity to re-present it. So I think a lot of the issue with this case is the physical evidence. I mean, the crime scene itself, it's extremely gruesome. The crime is extremely gruesome. And people are going to have a hard time wrapping their mind around the fact that someone could do this to not just their own child, but children that they're involved in their lives. I think it's easier in terms of the motive for the jury to go to that there's some drug-related motive as opposed to, a crime of passion that would lead to someone killing their own child and killing 2 other children. So I think they have to really work on presenting to the jury what the motivation for that crime is going to be and how they can tie the defendant to that crime scene physically.
That's certainly a good point. I mean, the evidence is something we need to discuss here, and I did forget to mention that the motive prosecutors are alleging is that Henry Segura owed $20,000 in child support payments. He was overdue on these payments. They say he wanted to travel abroad. He wanted to get a job in Afghanistan, a lucrative 6-figure job, but he couldn't do that with these child support charges on his record. Defense says, hey, he also owed child support to another woman, though, and he didn't kill her. Interesting point. Paula, let me bring you in. You're the defense. The first time around, I mean, your client almost got off. The jury swung 8-4 towards an acquittal. How do you approach the case this time?
Well, the retrial is always tough because during the first trial, you have the luxury of the reaction of witnesses the first time to questions they've never heard before. They haven't had a chance to answer those questions, and you'll get those golden responses which make the witnesses lack credibility. So the second trial, everyone's prepared, everyone knows what the defense is. In this particular case, it's a hard case for the defense because they actually they're trying to put on a case, they're trying to put on a defense, and they're actually trying to prove to the jury, which they don't have to do, who did it. You know, there are alternative suspects, and they actually have to put on a story about these suspects and convince the jury that that's really what happened. And this is just not, in my opinion, beyond a reasonable doubt.
And one of the other suspects, James Carlos Santos, he's a Vice Lord gang member, apparently has said that he ordered the hit from prison, and it's possible that he's going to testify this time around. So we're going to see whether that happens, because that could make a big difference. He did not testify the first time around. In the meantime, though, let's go back into court live. Welcome back to the afternoon session. The quadruple murder trial against Henry Segura. The retrial continues at this hour out of Tallahassee, Florida. Right now, we're seeing photos of the crime scene, Brandy Peters' apartment, that green plant you see over to the top right that the laser beam is on. That's a plant that was apparently knocked over in the struggle. The struggle prosecutors say she had with her murderer. She was found shot multiple times, but ultimately the medical examiner said she died of blunt trauma, force to the head, and so it was quite an attack on her. Her 3 children also found dead, piled up in the bathtub, including one of the defendant's old children, Javante Segura, who was just 3 years old, who you see on the right. The 2 girls in the middle were 6-year-old twin girls, all of them being murdered that night back in 2010. Right now on the stand, we are hearing from a fingerprints examiner, a forensics expert who was walking the jury through all of the evidence that was found in the apartment in the crime scene. Earlier, she was taking jurors through the bathroom where the children's 3 bodies were found in the bathtub, and talking about where she was able to take swabs and so forth. DNA is going to be a big issue in this case, perhaps lack of DNA. What we do know from the first time around is that the prosecutors will say that Henry Segura's DNA was found on a bathroom, the bathtub grab bar, a bar in the bathtub, and they are suggesting that's evidence that he was involved in drowning the children, putting the children's bodies there. But his attorneys say, hey, not so fast. That was the DNA of his son. Father and son, they have similar DNA, right? Presumably the child was bathed in that bathtub. What do we make of this one piece of evidence? Let me bring in Paula Nattori, who's live in the studio with me.
I'm not, this piece of evidence for me is not dispositive of anything. I mean, clearly he's having an affair with Brandy Peters. He spends a lot of time at that apartment, that house, and it's expected that his DNA will be, you know, and DNA transfers. I mean, to me, the fact that even if it is his DNA, so what? That doesn't convince me of anything.
Right. I mean, this is a good point. They were having a relationship. He was married. This was an extramarital relationship, but they had a 3-year-old child together. He went over the house frequently. So is it a shock that his DNA would show up in the apartment? I mean, what about the fact that it is in the bathtub where the children's bodies are found? Sue Ann Robinson, also a criminal defense attorney and a former prosecutor, let me bring you in. What's your take on that DNA in the bathtub?
Yeah, I think the DNA and the fingerprint evidence is great. The issue is that the prosecution has to tie this evidence to the defendant and to their theory of the case, which they're attempting to by saying, hey, you know, his DNA is in the bathtub and this is where the bodies are found. But I just think that that's a stretch for the jury to say that someone who, as you've said already, someone who frequents the home, someone who's in the home, who's possibly took a bath themselves in the home, the reason why his DNA is in the bathtub is because he committed the crime. I don't think that's beyond a reasonable doubt. I think that all this evidence is important to introduce for, you know, purposes of the trial, but I think the prosecution has to do a better job of tying the evidence to the actual defendant that they're trying to convict in this case, or else they're going to end up in a similar situation that they did before.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, much more live from this quadruple murder trial out of Florida. Stick around.